My name and welcome to the second of our 3 launch events for our series on alternative regulatory responses to misinformation. My name is Michael Karen-Nicholas, and I'm the Wikimedia Fellow at Yale Law School, where I run the Initiative on Intermediaries and Information. I will note at the outset that this meeting is being recorded, so if you activate your camera, your image may be captured as part of that, or if you participate in the Q&A, you may be recorded as part of that, though we would very much encourage you to participate. So as I mentioned, this is the second of 3 launch events for our series. Both papers today focus on efforts to promote information literacy and informed engagement with material online, though there are 2 very different strategies for approaching that challenge, complementary strategies, I think. And we have 2 of our authors here today who will be presenting their work, followed by 2 wonderful commenters, following which we'll have discussion and Q&A. If at any point you have a question or a comment, please feel free to either enter it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function at any point to start a queue for when the discussion period begins. I always see these events where they say like, great, now we're gonna have a Q&A, and then it's 10 minutes before people start raising their hands. Raise your hands whenever a question occurs to you, because we're happy to start the queue at any time. So I will start with a brief introduction of our 2 authors. Lisa Mcpherson is a Senior Policy Fellow at Public Knowledge, a public interest advocacy group that promotes freedom of expression and open internet and access to affordable communications tools and creative works. Her specific focus is healthy information systems, including countering misinformation and developing alternative funding models for local journalism. Prior to Public Knowledge, Lisa was a consumer marketing executive at consumer brands like Fisher-Price, Timberland, Hallmark, and Custom Ink. In 2017, she was selected as one of the DC Tech Week 100, which recognizes excellence in technology and entrepreneurship in the DC area. But her experience driving digital marketing transformation on behalf of brands led to concerns over broader impacts of digital technology on individual well-being, society, and democracy. She left marketing and participated in the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard University, where she is still a senior fellow. She has a BA from Colgate University and an MBA from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Jonathan Obar is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at York University. He also serves as a research fellow at the Quello Center at Michigan State University. His research focuses on information and communication policy, addressing connections between digital media technologies, civil liberties, and the inclusiveness of public cultures. And we also have 2 commenters with us. Stephen LaPorte is legal director for the Wikimedia Foundation. He works on litigation, free licensing, product counseling, and public policy. He is an active contributor to open source software projects and has written about how open source communities handle trademark rights. Sandra Cortez is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and the director of Youth and Media. She is responsible for coordinating the youth and media policy, research and educational initiatives, and is leading the collaboration between Berkman Klein and UNICEF. At Youth and Media, Sandra works closely with talented young people to lead researchers in the field as they look into innovative ways to approach social challenges in the digital world. Together with Berkman Klein Center's executive director, Urs Gasser, and the Youth and Media team, she focuses on topics such as inequitable access, information quality, risks to safety and privacy, skills and digital literacy, and spaces for participation, civic engagement, and innovation. So I cannot imagine a better set of commenters to be discussing these papers, and I'm very excited for the conversation. We will open things up with first Lisa, and then move on to Jonathan, each of which will get a chance to present their work. Lisa, do you want to take it away?
Great, I'd be happy to. I actually want to start by thanking you, Michael, and the Yale ISP for hosting this event, and in particular for inviting civil society groups like Public Knowledge to be a part of this critical discussion. I'm so honored to be in the company of the other authors and of the incredibly talented commenters. I also appreciate your, Michael, thoughtful comments and edits throughout this process, and in particular, the ISP team's very careful review of both the expression and the citation of our ideas. So thank you so much. I'm going to talk about the Superfund for the internet, and misinformation on digital platforms has sometimes been compared by critics to toxic chemicals dumped into fresh water by industrial companies. And so our proposal is inspired by the EPA's Superfund that ultimately cleaned up over 400 toxic waste sites. Our Superfund proposal is based on kind of two important ideas. The first is that our contemporary information system is complex and interconnected, and its health and its ability to stimulate a healthy and robust civic discourse is the product of both the amount of misinformation and the availability and viability of authoritative information. And that's why our Superfund works to alleviate those twin problems: misinformation on digital platforms and the genuine crisis facing local journalism in this country. The second idea it's based on is a growing body of evidence about the potential role of fact-checking in mitigating misinformation on digital platforms. For clarity, right at the outset, fact-checking hasn't always been proven to change people's minds, particularly when the topic is driven by political ideology or when it's subject to motivated reasoning. But what we have learned through the research and from the platform's own reports is that fact-checking, combined with the changes in user experience that platforms make enabled by those fact checks, can have a material impact on the spread and therefore the potential harms of misinformation. So with those as kind of our foundational ideas, here's how the Superfund is structured. First, we would propose using public policy tools to create a market mechanism that increases demand and payment for fact-checking from the major digital platforms, and it encourages the development and the supply of those services as a new revenue stream among local news organizations. The policy would first require that they sort of consider the dominance of the major digital platforms in our discourse today and mandate that they adopt an approach within their content moderation approaches that serves the public interest. And specifically, it would require that qualifying platforms include a fact-checking process in their content moderation approach. The policy would also establish a federal trust fund administered by an independent government body. The trust fund would be funded or populated by large digital platforms that meet certain standards. Those standards would include their scale, measured by both revenue and the number of users, by their business model and how strongly it sort of incents the spread of information, and what their business model does in terms of indexing or linking to or finding information. Those dimensions, those criteria can be assumed to have a correlation with the importance of the platforms in public discourse, and again, their incentives for amplifying information. We're proposing that the contributions to the trust fund be based, sort of take the form of a federal user fee, which has precedence in things like tobacco, filing fees at the SEC, and so on. And the amount of that federal user fee by platform would be based on their monthly active users. Again, a measure of scale and one that can be correlated with the sort of spread of misinformation on their platform. If that's kind of the demand side, the supply side of the Superfund would work like this. The independent body would allocate payments from the trust fund based on the actual amount of service, fact-checking services, provided by qualified news organizations. The news organizations would become qualified through one of the existing organizations that provide practices and policies associated with fact-checking, most notably the International Fact-Checking Network. They require adherence to a code of principles that have been globally developed and that are a series of commitments that organizations commit to abide by for excellence in fact-checking. We believe that local news organizations are particularly well suited to create this supply and to be certified. First, because they're the most trusted source of information for communities. And second, because fact-checking is at bottom the application of a set of strong journalistic principles: transparency, verification, the availability of a corrections process, and so they're particularly well qualified. The funds would be allocated to the fact-checking organizations, again, not based on a discretionary or arbitrary process, but by the actual amount of service that the fact-checking organizations provided to the platforms, potentially based on kind of a constant rate. Some important notes about how we're thinking about this. First, the platforms would continue to set their own terms of service and community standards and content moderation approaches, which would now need to include a fact-checking process. The platforms would continue to select the organizations with which they partner in a way that supports their own community standards and is compatible with their own audiences. The platforms would continue to determine what changes in user experience they would make as a result of the fact-checking findings, again, to support their own community standards. And critically, the Superfund's independent administrator does not have any role in selecting what content to evaluate, how it's reviewed, what the results of the fact check are, or whether or how the platforms act on that content. So that is not within its scopes. All of the major digital platforms, and certainly the ones that will recommend and qualify for the Superfund, use fact-checking in some form today, but it varies widely by platform. Researchers say it's very difficult to know what the outcomes are because of the lack of availability of information. There's conditions often put on access to that data, and the platforms control virtually every aspect of their interaction with the fact-checking organization. So the last thing we would do is ensure that the independent government body also establishes a framework for the transparency of relationships between the news organizations and the platforms, reporting mechanisms because of the introduction of a public interest obligation can allow oversight, and sharing of best practices about the results that they obtain through the fact-checking process and the application of their own content moderation standards. So we also feel that would be within kind of what the capability of the independent bodies would be. And that's our Superfund.
Thank you so much. Fascinating stuff. We go now to Jonathan Obar for his discussion of his own paper.
Hi, everyone. Just going to start my clock here. So first of all, thank you to the Yale Information Society Project, to the Wikimedia Foundation, and especially to Michael for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank the other authors, of course, and the team for the reviews, edits, and the terrific working group experience. To summarize what I'm proposing, it's vision and funding from federal government agencies primarily to support users, individuals, to achieve basically information literacy supports, to educate the public so that we, to use Wikipedia terminology, we have an army of volunteers from, all over the place helping the platforms and the fact checkers to, solve these misinformation and disinformation challenges. So I wanted to begin this way. Ask yourself, is there an information source that you trust? Think of one source of information that you feel you can go to when you're trying to understand, as Walter Lippmann once said, the world outside and the pictures in our heads. Human beings seem naturally drawn to single sources of information we feel we can trust, feel being an important word here. One problem with blindly trusting a single source, however, is that its information may be questionable and require checking. What's more is that, and critical theorists have been writing about this for some time, if a problematic source provides material that reinforces prior beliefs, makes us feel safe, or helps us to realize our confirmation bias, it can be challenging to break from it. Source triangulation is an information validation strategy that I write about that is altogether different from this. Instead of learning outcomes that result from reliance on a single source, the ability to find, evaluate, and draw accurate information by comparing sources and corroborating sources should be a primary focus of educational investment. And this is really what the paper is all about. So just to clarify in terms of the definition, source triangulation, which is like a sub-concept associated with information literacy, is information validation through access and assessment of multiple sources with the aim of finding credible commonality. To borrow terminology from the Civic Online Reasoning Project at Stanford, instead of reading vertically to check a source online, they describe, you access a source, you look, scroll up and down, look at the layout and the quality of the individual source, maybe check the about page. What individuals should be doing, what they should be taught to do, is to read, as the Stanford group says, laterally, right? Open tabs and read various pages to find this credible commonality. As the group said in a study that found fact checkers engaging in lateral reading, fact checkers learned most about a site by leaving it. You need to find other sources and compare and corroborate information to figure out distinctions between fact, fallacy, and fake. Now we can revisit questions about the possibilities and limitations of credible commonality. You might be thinking, well, what about echo chambers? That's certainly a problem and emphasizes why broader information literacy training is important. But for our current purposes, lateral reading across various information sources with the aim of finding this credible commonality is the primary goal. I should clarify that source triangulation skills are, again, just one component of a broader information literacy education that we need to do a lot of research on to really figure out what's needed. It might involve teaching individuals how to navigate user interfaces, how to identify, so-called dark pattern designs, political economic motivations of platforms and sources, and even biased algorithms, data sets, and big data discrimination, all examples that contribute to the treacherous information environments that we encounter online. So with this as the context, the paper offers basically two policy recommendations, just to reiterate what I said previously. US federal government agencies that are involved in addressing like technology and education questions should develop an expansive vision of digital inclusion that includes the use of technologies, not just access to technologies, but also use of technologies, focusing on information literacy in general and source triangulation in particular. So again, just to clarify rather, digital inclusion is referred to here as meaning more than ensuring access to the internet, which of course is important, but also opportunities for learning how to use the internet to navigate it and its information sources. Secondly, the work of groups like the National Digital Inclusion Alliance should be complemented by funding efforts to realize these information literacy skills in schools, libraries, and other for and nonprofit scenarios, including platforms and what I call infomediation initiatives. So specifically, to get a bit more specific, in terms of the agencies, 3 agencies that I talk about in the paper. So starting with the Institute of Museum and Library Services. These are federal government agencies in the United States. This particular agency that I start with should prioritize source triangulation skills as part of its vision. Again, vision being a focus that the agency would contribute to the discourse. For, again, initiatives at libraries across the country and across the world, and also fund efforts to develop and promote that vision. The Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology, which, quote, establishes the vision for how technology can be used to transform teaching and learning, right? So there already, you see, as part of its mandate, vision is part of its, of what it's supposed to be doing. And it should make source triangulation central to that vision and related funding efforts. So for example, this particular agency has something that they put out a few years ago called the 2017 National Education Technology Plan. But information literacy is only mentioned in passing. So new plans should emphasize information literacy. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, this is the 3rd agency I talk about, via its Universal Service Fund, and specifically the E-Rate and Lifeline programs, right, which provide funding to schools and libraries, should again ensure vision and funding for information literacy efforts. And I should add that the FCC is already moving in this direction. In particular, its Lifeline program is now prioritizing digital inclusion, making it a, quote, national priority. I also offer 2 additional recommendations, which I'll just mention briefly. The first is, supporting platforms as they attempt to educate users and develop software that will, dynamically engage users in the process of education, and also like figuring out what to do in the online space, right? And we're starting to see this, like on YouTube, and this is relevant certainly to the Wikimedia Foundation. Increasingly, YouTube is nudging people to do this source triangulation work. They'll provide, YouTube is providing links in some cases, next to its videos to Wikipedia articles, so people can check information for themselves, learn more about the organization that posted the video, and for example. Twitter, famously now, around the most recent presidential election in the United States, was like fact-checking tweets in real time, posting links, to more information about questionable information posted there about election results. So platforms are beginning to convey that users should learn not to trust single sources and instead consider multiple sources as a default information engagement strategies. And again, these efforts could be supported and expanded to include more dynamic engagement and educational opportunities, similar to what we're seeing in the privacy space with platforms getting involved with more dynamic forms of online consent. And lastly, one other thing which I'm happy to talk about more, I just will refer to it briefly now, is the development and funding of infomediation services, which might emulate similar services emerging in the online reputation management industry, which again provides support for these education and engagement end goals that we hope that individuals will be able to achieve. In closing, each of these policy efforts must follow a distributive justice approach to policymaking, with the aim of achieving an equitable distribution of resources that acknowledges the challenges unique to marginalized and vulnerable communities. As I say at the end of the paper, as technology changes, imagining new governance models can be difficult, especially when current and, let's be honest here, ineffective approaches have been in place for some time. We need to provide the information literacy training that can help people to navigate the treacherous information environments online. Otherwise, how will we ever distinguish between fact, fallacy, and fake? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. There's an interesting complementarity between those 2 papers, just as you were wrapping up, that I noticed for the first time, insofar as triangulation certainly necessitates greater independent sources of verification, and we have, you mentioned the funding as well, but we have this discussion in Lisa's paper as well about channeling greater funding to those verification mechanisms. So it is interesting to read those together. We're going to go first to Stephen LaPorte for commentary, and then to Sandra after that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you to both our authors for sharing their papers and their ideas here today. I found it really valuable to see the diversity of models that are being proposed and discussed as we grapple with the harm caused by disinformation. In the introduction to his paper, Jonathan describes the urgency and importance of addressing our deteriorating information environment. And this statement really resonated with me. Thinking about disinformation as part of a complex environmental challenge is one of the common themes I see linking both of these papers. And I think it's worth digging into some of the links and common principles shared between these papers to understand how they connect and understand how they can motivate other policy considerations. I'm going to talk briefly about the 2 models that Lisa and Jonathan have presented today. Then second, talk about some of these common principles that I identified and how they should influence our approach to dealing with the harm caused by disinformation. And then finally, I'll end with a few questions for Lisa and Jonathan that I hope can encourage some conversation about the connections between these 2 papers. In a statement that Lisa had published on the Public Knowledge blog, she quoted a researcher applying the Swiss cheese model to how we handle disinformation. And I really liked this, this model as sort of a visual metaphor for how we handle complex challenges. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Swiss cheese model, it's a beautifully simple way of describing how we can stack up multiple strategies for dealing with a really complex challenge. Individually, each layer may be imperfect, may not provide complete protection, may have holes in it like Swiss cheese, but used in combination with other protective steps, they can achieve very significant results. I think it's useful to consider both of the models that we've heard about today as separate but complementary layers in building societal efforts to address the deteriorating information environment that Jonathan has spoken about. And I really think it's important to look at how these layers connect with each other to see where the holes may exist and to make sure that we have enough protection along the way to really make meaningful impact on the issue. In the Superfund for the Internet proposal, Lisa highlights 3 interrelated problems that I found incredibly important. First, that platforms have business models that benefit from the amplification of and engagement with information that sometimes includes misinformation. Second, that there's a media industry struggling with how it finds sustainable financial support. And third, the need to navigate First Amendment and free expression considerations when the government is involved in solving any problem that has speech at its core. And I think that her paper does a good job of linking these 3 different problems together to find a complementary solution that can really find the advantages of all 3. Her model proposes an independent body that can address these issues in combination. In Jonathan's paper, he discusses the source triangulation skills that he just presented a few minutes ago, and he encourages taking an expansive view of digital inclusion. He describes the problem that users face when they confront misinformation and how they sort between helpful and unhelpful information on the internet. His model proposes prioritizing funding for education around this source triangulation model, and I'll discuss a little bit more about how I think that has other policy implications in a minute. I appreciate that both of these models recognize that misinformation exists within an ecosystem of information sources, platforms where information spreads, and individuals who are making choices about what they read and what they share. And then all of these things influence the democratic institutions that we need to turn to if we're going to find a regulatory solution to this overarching problem. So some of the common principles. First, I think it's important to consider the supply chain for reliable information. When we look expansively at the problems caused by misinformation, it's important to recognize that reliable sources of information are an essential ingredient, regardless of which level in the Swiss cheese model you're going to discuss. As Lisa mentions, there's real importance to funding some of this work, but ultimately it's important that this work is available to people who need it at the time when they need it. So Wikipedia is built on a series of policies around accuracy and neutrality, but all of these policies rely on the availability of reliable sources. They need to be available to users. They need to be available to users preferably in their language so they can actually use them. Having a link that you can click but don't not understand doesn't help you validate that information. And Wikipedia has a series of policies that differentiate between primary and secondary sources, consider the source's authority, its age, its context. All of these pieces of information are things that users need to piece together and platforms need to understand the misinformation problem. Together, these problems allowed Wikipedians to sort through and curate information on important topics like the COVID-19 pandemic, but I mentioned this supply chain of information because it's not just the source, but it's how the source is curated and then how that source is integrated into other platforms. And at each step along the way, there needs to be protections against the spread of misinformation. We have a collective interest in ensuring the sustainability, accessibility, and diversity within our information ecosystem. Second, I think it's important to consider meaningful user-centric transparency. Platforms share data already through transparency reports and by creating pathways for researchers to understand what sort of information is available on their sites. But this idea of transparency really needs to be user-centric to enable users to be part of solutions to misinformation problems. It's about empowering users to participate in decision-making, not just to have access to raw data. So Wikipedia, as an example, contains records of how sources are discussed and weighed. There's notice boards for discussion of reliable sources. And there's this common citation needed flag that is both a warning about the reliability of information, but also an invitation to come in and correct the thing that is being flagged. But one lesson that Wikipedia, I think, can teach us about the importance of transparency is that access to information alone is not enough. There can still be biases in who chooses to participate. Sorting through raw information can be difficult. Important pieces can be lost. And the factors or facets that researchers need to make decisions may not be available if you just make a raw information dump out there. So it's important to think about barriers to participation, systematic biases among participants, and really thinking about transparency as something that needs to be applied in order to be useful. So transparency that has a user-centric solution is really important. And then third, the support for individuals. I'm in strong agreement with Jonathan's persuasive case that digital literacy is an essential component of education and inclusion. I think contributing to Wikipedia can be one way that people hone this skill, including in a classroom setting. It's a way to grapple with decisions that need to be made around sources. And in Wikipedia, it's a sort of a really honed in situation where you have a very common goal with you're writing an article about something and you're trying to comply with Wikipedia policies. But I think these are skills that people who participate in Wikipedia can take to other platforms because we need to be able to use these skills throughout our daily life. It's important for journalists and for other platforms to understand that they are also helping users hone these skills. So I really like Jonathan's idea that platforms can be part of designing features or patterns that encourage information literacy. And thinking from an industry perspective, there's already great initiatives around inclusion. So building evaluations of accessibility and mobile design inside of platforms is something that software engineers think about a lot. How can we build in common standards, maybe at the technical standard level, around information literacy that encourage this to be a factor for inclusion? It's not just how long your website takes to load, but it's what people do when the website loads. And then finally, protections for free expression are extremely important. Lisa correctly identifies that this is one of the challenges of a government-led initiative, and she does a good job explaining some of the limitations that would need to be put on a regulatory solution in order to protect free expression rights that individuals have. But at the end of the day, someone needs to decide which speech is disinformation and which speech is not. And I think that decision is really where the free expression rights need to come in. There's all sorts of questions when you build a process, like who qualifies as a fact checker, what degree of transparency is allowed, how do we enable meaningful transparency, meaningful engagement, and how do we protect these systems from abuse or manipulation? And Lisa's paper notes that platforms adopt a lot of power in this regard. So I think it's important, especially when we consider these issues internationally, to build in affirmative protections for free expression whenever we're making a decision about what is misinformation and what is not. So I'll conclude with a few questions to encourage conversation. For Jonathan, I'd love to hear more about some of the policy prerequisites for this strategy that prioritizes information literacy. I think echo chambers is a really important policy consideration, but I also think of this common concern that you hear on the internet about how truth can be behind a paywall, but harmful or false information can just spread freely and quickly. So when I think of something like lateral reading, I realize like I need a device that is free, that I can navigate from one tab to the other. If I don't have equal access to the internet, or if I have a lot of restrictions on the device that I'm using, it can really impede my ability to do some of the skills that you have, to practice some of the skills that you've identified. So what are the policy prerequisites for this information literacy priority to work? And then for Lisa, I'd really like to hear more about the safeguards for free expression, specifically in where we ensure that the processes are effective. You note that fact checkers exist on platforms and that there are voluntary efforts that platforms have adopted that have come up short. So when we think about how we move from where we are today to an effective system, what needs to change to ensure that it actually is effective, and how do we protect free expression in that process? Is it a realignment of incentives? Does it exist in the market space? I just love to hear more about this question of effectiveness. So I'll wrap up there and just say thank you again for sharing your papers, your really thoughtful approach, and thank you to Michael for organizing this conversation. I look forward to hearing discussion with the other members of this call.
Yeah, thank you for that. Wonderful questions, and also a great reminder of how multifaceted this challenge is. You know, you always want to keep the discussion focused on a particular aspect of the issue, but it's very difficult to do because these challenges, you mentioned interoperability, these challenges are all interrelated, and certainly it's difficult to tackle one without addressing the other. We'll go now to Sandra Cortez for her own commentary.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the invitation and for having me here today. I feel very humbled to be among these colleagues, to be honest, and to be a commentator. But I will do my best to share some observations that connect to youth and media's work. Just for context, I am a psychologist, and my work focuses on young people ages 12 to 18, although some of the work and its findings applies to adults and society more broadly. I'm thrilled to be here, big Wikimedia fan and longtime collaborator. We're actually in the midst of conducting a study in Latin America in the context of information quality, trying to understand how young people search, evaluate, create, and share information with each other, particularly in the context of health, education, the future of work, and environmental issues. So I feel this topic is very much close to what I'm currently thinking about. Because of my work, I particularly could very much relate also to Jonathan's paper around information literacy, or as youth and media, we call it more skills in the area of information quality. We wrote in 2012 a report called Youth and Digital Media from Credibility to Information Quality that I think touches on some of the elements in the paper. And we, not too long ago, released also a set of educational activities in collaboration with First Draft around information verification that are freely available to schools around the world, Creative Commons licensed. What I particularly agree with also in Jonathan's paper is the argument to think beyond access to devices. We have studied many of the initiatives by governments to enhance digital citizenship or digital literacy, and they very much focus on providing students with tablets, laptops, you name it, and sometimes miss to think beyond that, what meaningful then engagement would look like. So I fully agree with that. And I also very much liked the proposal to essentially add information literacy as an essential part into schools and their curricula, because probably only by doing so, it scales or it becomes available to all students, especially those from traditionally undersourced or more marginalized communities. Maybe just 3 points from my own work, kind of more in the food for thought or for conversation space for later on that connect, I think, to both papers to an extent. What we learned in the context of our information quality work, including talking to many young people about their engagement with information, is in order for a young person to be able to have relevant skills in the context of information quality, we may need to consider the full information life cycle. I think Jonathan touched on this to a certain extent, and also Stephen before mentioned it. But what do I mean by that? Many people's work and initiatives or strategies to navigate information or the problem of mis and disinformation tend to focus on information once it's in front of a user. and how to deal with that experience or that moment. Could be a social media post or an email or a WhatsApp message or even a video on YouTube. Yet our research suggests that if we want to better address the issue of mis and disinformation, we have to equally consider how people search for or come across that information, and then what they do with it once they have it. Do they share it? Do they comment on it? Or do they edit it? So I very much agree with Jonathan when he says that source triangulation is essentially one skill towards becoming information literate. The second observation that connects to our work is I always find people that look at educational systems and what they're trying to teach really, really admirable, because I find many educational ecosystems, including the US one, quite complex and nebulous when you try to further really at detail understand what they're trying to teach or require schools and districts to include in their curriculum. So looking at Jonathan's paper, looking specifically at information literacy, what I learned through our own work here at Wikimedia is that information literacy is essentially one way to describe the issue, and that there are about 6 to 8 other similar concepts and frameworks that governments, districts, and schools use to describe skills that young people need in the context of information quality, meaning that it's hard to say if what you were looking for wasn't really there, or if it was hidden behind different terms and concepts such as media literacy, digital literacy, online safety, or 21st century skills. I'm really curious about your thoughts there. We just finished a global mapping exercise as part of a report called Youth and Digital Citizenship Plus, where we analyzed about 35 different digital skills frameworks, including several in the United States, and essentially came to the conclusion that it's a big chaos. It took us about 3 years to come to that conclusion. But you see in that report a mapping and the different areas of life that we find relevant and in which we think young people currently should have digital skills. What we identified in the mapping is that information literacy or information quality, that area, has actually been addressed quite well by most programs, or is one of the more popular areas that people hope to address. What is maybe concerning is that most of those initiatives or programs rarely have been developed with inputs by young people. So they address information literacy from a very adult normative way, and in very few times they talk about the platforms or spaces from Wikimedia to TikTok that are really at the center of young people's engagement with the digital world. And maybe last point, just very quickly, to end on a personal note, most people know me for always being an optimist, always thinking about young people and how we could empower them and increase their participation, provide maximum agency, and so forth. I believe in the importance of skills, but when it comes to mis and disinformation, I'm skeptical that the solution is to teach students that they are masters of their knowledge, or all they have to do is research or source triangulation for themselves and they will know what is real. What I agree with Lisa is that, one, the current mis and disinformation problem is leading to a lot of frustration among young people and resignation in many cases. So we need to come up with solutions. But two, young people don't grow up in a vacuum. And some of you mentioned it previously. but they get raised with certain beliefs, are currently, particularly in the US, growing up in a culture of doubt and critique, and are raised to believe that experience is more important than expertise. And three, as Jonathan rightly so mentioned in his paper, there are systemic forces at play that we need to consider, and we need to consider things like algorithmic curation or filter bubbles, bots, fake reports, and videos or content that has been purposefully designed to manipulate an individual. So addressing the mis and disinformation problem, in my opinion, is going to require a lot more than filtering, labeling, comparing, or fact-checking. It's going to require a shift in how we make sense of information, whom or what we trust, and how we understand our own individual role when engaging with information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of very interesting food for thought. Why don't we go back to first to Lisa and then to Jonathan for their own responses to all those wonderful questions. And in the meantime, once again, if folks have questions, please don't be shy about raising their hand or plugging them into the chat. Lisa.
Sure. I'm going to start by addressing Stephen's question about protection of free expression. And I'm going to begin, for those who may not have read the paper, to talk about how we believe we're doing that in the construction of the Superfund. But I'm also going to take Stephen's question as impetus for us to consider thinking about that, both in how we evolve Superfund and how public knowledge may develop additional solutions to try to improve the quality of our information environment, if that would be all right. Obviously, in the US, the largest single protection is the First Amendment, and it is both that and just a general care about freedom of expression in any international context that really structured how we thought about the structure of the Superfund. They are reasons to take enormous care in any introduction of the government in speech. I think we all know that the digital platforms can absolutely embody and exercise their own community approaches in terms of standards. That's an expression of their own speech. Fact-checking in and of itself can represent counter speech, the kind of thing that our First Amendment is meant to protect. And so those behaviors by the platforms, I think, are generally seen as very compatible with freedom of expression. The key question for us is whether the introduction of the government in compelling certain approaches creates a nexus between the platform's behaviors and speech. So that is why, as I said, the structure of our governing body gives it no role in the review of content, the evaluation of content, or the action taken on content. That remains within the behaviors and the rights of the platforms. The policy mechanism only requires that a fact-checking process be in place without regard to the content, the viewpoint expressed in the content, the perspective in that content, et cetera. And then it is essentially a mechanism for creating payment. So its role is really confined to those types of things. We also know that today, again, all of the major platforms that we're recommending qualify for this engage in fact-checking relationships. They talk with pride about those relationships and the results they get. So we don't feel like we're compelling them to do anything new and that is already within their kind of existing behaviors. They also speak proudly about their relationships and programs that they have to foster funding for local journalism. So this again leans into things that they already believe in and talk with pride about. We, in our proposal, the platforms continue to select the qualified organizations that are most compatible with their own terms of service and community standards and their audiences, which may mean that they have relationships with a range of organizations that represent different points on the political spectrum, as organizations qualified by the IFCN do today. So that's all remaining within the platform's discretion. We also think that because our proposal is process-based, not content-based, that it provides some assurance of free expression, and it is also quite narrowly tailored to suit what has been determined a government interest, and that is ensuring the quality and availability of diverse and healthy information that fosters civil discourse. Those public interests may get expanded when it's things like coronavirus misinformation and we're talking about public health, or about hate speech that might induce violence. And so we have another set of considerations. And that's why kind of the focus of the content is so important. So again, those are the ways we think we've structured it within the Superfund, but I also take the question as an impetus for us to just ensure that rigor exists in this and in any other principles that we might develop in this space.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you started there by framing the conceptual gap between thinking about the First Amendment challenges and thinking about the freedom of expression challenges, because those are different questions. And it's one thing to say, will a judge, or will ultimately 9 judges, find that a particular formula is consistent with prior jurisprudence on this issue, and you know, there are steps that you can take, as you discuss in your paper, to mitigate that. And then it's an entirely different question to think about the freedom of expression implications, which is particularly relevant as we think about scalability of these issues across different jurisdictions, which I hope we're going to get to later on. Jonathan, you had a lot of very interesting questions thrown your way. What are your thoughts?
So first of all, again, I really appreciate the thoughtful commentary and the questions. It's always like so wonderful to have the, other academics and civil society members read the work, and I really appreciate this dialogue. So just to start with the first commentary, meaningful transparency for users, meaningful engagement. I should say that a lot of my work in this space, actually, in terms of like involving users effectively and meaningfully, is in the privacy space. I've done work on the biggest lie on the internet. I agree to the terms and conditions and the problem of dark patterns and that sort of thing. And does notice policy actually lead to engagement and results and things like this? I quoted Walter Lippmann on purpose because while I'm trying to be optimistic here myself, I do tend to align with Walter Lippmann's argument that he presents in The Phantom Public, that education can be really challenging because there's just so much to do to get this right. We're trying to work and to live life and to actually enjoy things sometimes, hopefully more than sometimes, and to sleep. How can we do all of these things if we're reading privacy policies all the time, or like learning to become fact checkers as these complicated information environments continue to evolve? And also we're supposed to look at all of our own big data too, to make sure that it's accurate. So there's a lot going on here, which is, I think, one of the reasons that while we're also, I think, not forgetting about the user and the individual needs of the user, I think that always should be expressed. I think I differ from Lippmann in that way. We also need to understand that the platforms need to be involved in, as was expressed, like user-centric solutions. Like, as I mentioned briefly, dynamic engagement opportunities, perhaps similar. I think the privacy space we're a bit farther along, like learning from like what dynamic consent is certainly not there yet to what is necessary for meaningful engagement in privacy protections. But I think it's farther along in terms of discussion, and I think that we should be looking to that space and collaborating with that space to sort of figure out what we can do to actually get people to deal with all of the different things that we're asked to do. Lippmann, I'm going to paraphrase, said once, as I cast my gaze on one thing, 1,000 others undergo great changes. And that's a huge responsibility for people to navigate. And so this is one of the reasons that at the end of the paper, it's an area that I'm working on increasingly. I talk about infomediation, looking at the reputation management industry as a place where we can see like sort of these new 21st century digital responsibilities, and how do we help individuals with those responsibilities? How can we delegate to others other than the so-called fiduciaries, right? We need others to help us as well. The policy prerequisites, by the way, stop me if I'm going too long. There's lots to say. Policy prerequisites, this is tough, right? This is really difficult. I think one thing that would be helpful to answer this question is, to have more open internet advocates involved with the government. I'm very happy to hear that Professor Tim Wu is going to be more involved in the direction of the current administration. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. We need more social scientists involved in this discussion so that we have more people advocating for the individual needs and studying the individual needs of users. But certainly, yes, truth can be behind a paywall. And this is one of the reasons that we need to be teaching students how to use Wikipedia properly, right? I've been part of the Wikimedia Foundation's student program for a decade. And when we introduce Wikipedia as a teaching tool in class, we not only teach students about like what's helpful and what's not helpful about Wikipedia, we teach them to like reflect on like the good things and the not good things about all different sources and strategies, and to engage in source triangulation, not like with everything being exactly the same, but recognizing there are distinctions between all the different sources and our own capabilities. So I think these are all important things to mention. So to get to the second commentary, yes. So is information literacy enough, right? Yeah, we need to figure out like, filter bubbles, echo chambers, dark patterns. This is like sort of, as was said, like the sorts of things that we may not think about, like when we're just talking about like, do you believe what's on the page? I would add, so Professor Leslie Shade and Professor Tamara Shepard have written about digital policy literacy. So teaching students not just about what's on the page or what's, the sort of the content or like what the feed is about, but understanding the policy processes, the political economy, and the infrastructure, right? Understanding that when you engage online, how the internet works and these sort of political economic questions is also important if we're going to be engaging people in discussions about the future of the internet and what it should look like. So lots, and all of this suggests, and this is the reason why I mentioned this, it all suggests that we need leadership and vision because there's a lot of different things going on at the same time. It's very clear that like as an educator who's, I'm teaching a class called Fake News and Fact Finding at the first year level. And just doing research for the course, you need information literacy just to navigate the materials about information literacy. So we need people to like organize these things and to lead and to say, and so I think that's really important. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So there's a couple of interesting questions that have been raised in the chat. I guess we'll start with one from Sean McLaughlin, who one of the things that struck me about his two comments is he talks about grounding infomediation efforts in the local community, lessons from community radio and broadband. I wrote a paper a few years back that basically used the analogy of broadcast regulation to understand what platforms are doing, to essentially see them as analogous to what Ofcom or ACMA does in essentially regulating attention or differentiating out access and virality in different ways. Do either of you have thoughts, or we can also open this up on the commenters as well, to our commenters as well, about potential lessons in traditional media or in how traditional media structures have tried to support local voices? Are there lessons there? Is there continuity? And how can those potentially be applied to this new information space? Just if anybody is interested in responding to that, you can unmute yourself. Or yes, Lisa.
I'm not sure I have the solutions that Sean is looking for, but I do want to lean intensely into part of his comment, which is about the importance of community grounded, local and community relevant information. We know from every piece of research, whether it's from Knight or from Gallup or from Pointer, that despite their challenges, local media, and particularly the local news media, newspapers, excuse me, represent the most trusted source available to communities today. It's not what it used to be, but it still stands above national media in the level of trust that it enjoys. And to me, that represents an asset and a potential broader role for local media in cleaning up our information ecosystem. And it does mean that it's something that we need more assertive policies to try to protect. Just as we've talked about, there are significant considerations involved in any public support of media. Can't help but notice that some of our most public supported media today are also the most trusted. So there's something there to work with. But to us, it does mean that we need more assertive public policy focused on ensuring media diversity regardless of the channel, finding a way to ground more media in local and community orientation and funding, finding ways to stimulate more entrepreneurial or innovative business models for journalism. It can play and should play an enormous role in ensuring we have information available to communities that can create this healthy civic discourse and abundant research on higher rates of corruption and higher costs and lower rates of political engagement in communities that have lost their local media.
I'll just add briefly. I mean, I think like Phil Napoli has written about, quite extensively now about, applying sort of the public interest standard in the 21st century. And I think, this sort of discussion has to continue as, the internet changes so much. So that's one point to make. And I also think that we can learn a lot from like the low power FM movement, for example. I think one thing that gets lost as the internet closes in on itself and we become more top down is the importance of listening to communities, not only in terms of like how a strategy is working, but where ideas or perspectives might be missing. And while localism efforts there were have been many over the years, like in the broadcasting context, we certainly haven't found the right solution. But again, I think we can learn a lot from low power FM and the need to focus on the localism concept. Social justice it can be global, but it also, many have argued that social justice is local. So I think I would look to the low power FM community.
Maybe just to add quickly, there is a really interesting project led by Mary Madden and Monica Bulger here in the US, looking at public media and how the voices and perspectives of young people and in different communities could be incorporated. I myself, as you can hear from my accent, I do some of my work in Switzerland, love the Swiss cheese analogy. And there I study, or I try to figure out how media organizations could involve communities, especially youth, at different levels of the organization. So either are we talking about co-creating content together, or are we talking about shaping policies and strategies and how those could become more inclusive? I think those are very different things. And so what we're doing is we are piloting different models at each level of what it could look like.
Yeah, one more component that I would add to what's been mentioned already as well is I'm personally a big advocate of public service media. That's not as popular in the U.S. As a Canadian, I'm a big believer in that. I think that the institutions like the BBC, like the CBC, the ABC in Australia are are an enormously important resource. Both in terms of finding that sort of centering the political discourse across the media, promoting professionalism. I think that's if you look at the Canadian system and compare it to the American system, there's a lot of commonalities. But I think one of the reasons why the Canadian political dialogue has resisted some of the tendencies that we've seen here in the US is that we do have the CBC to keep it grounded. And so I'm a strong advocate of that. As it relates to this issue specifically, there's been some folks, particularly Ethan Zuckerman, who've advocated for specifically for looking for a public service media model and trying to apply that to platforms. That opens a huge other can of worms of there are constitutional issues there are private property issues there. There's a lot of issues to be fleshed out, which I know that he's working on. But I do think that it's an interesting model to float, and certainly there's a very rich set of international standards stemming from both European jurisdictions and elsewhere in the world on public service media. There's another question within the chat from Bill Shribman. I hope I'm saying that right. That essentially ties into this broader idea of, I guess, ensuring integrity in the discourse is how I would describe it. And certainly that's an issue that Lisa addresses to a certain degree in her own paper in terms of fact-checking organizations. I think that potentially also comes up on the questions of source triangulation. But about differentiating between good sources of information and bad, and also how you deal with this entire sort of parallel universe of research emerging. It brings in Wikimedia as well. I don't know if Stephen has commentary on that, or if anybody would like to respond to what's been put in the chat on that. Lots of nodding, but nobody's unmuting. Shall I call on someone? Jonathan, please.
So in terms of, it's amazing, like, media scholars for years were talking about how to open up the marketplace of ideas to alternative perspectives. And now we're talking about like, whoa, like, is there too much speech? And I think we have to be careful with being like sort of reintroducing gatekeeping models. I think that can be a problem. I think we should look to Wikipedia as a tremendous example of what can happen when individuals can come together to work on things together. Wikipedia certainly has its problems. Certainly in the social network, there is the gender imbalance, and there are other issues. It's hard to say, how do we get, and this is one of the questions that, as I say in the paper, it sort of ties us to like one of our oldest debates, right? How do we determine like who gets to govern society, right? Is it the individual or is it the expert? And how do we define expertise ever? It's quite difficult. And I should mention that I think we need to be careful when going back to a model where brand helps to determine expertise or credibility, because I think that takes us to will take us to a very sort of corporate closed system where lots of voices are marginalized or left out. So it's not an easy answer, so again, more questions than answers. I think a lot more research needs to be done. But again, if we haven't solved the expert versus amateur question in thousands of years, it might be hard to do it, on the call. Yeah.
I heartily agree with the need for more research and understanding in this space. One point that I think gets overlooked in open models is the discoursive nature of Wikipedia. Having open systems doesn't necessarily mean that everything is happening in isolation and like an infinite playing field. I think that a lot of Wikipedia's quality control mechanisms come from shared spaces where people actually have to have a discussion and reach a conclusion. And there's sort of dispute resolution mechanisms and social norms and everything that's been heavily researched in the Wikipedia space. But as other platforms consider adopting more openness and more transparency, if they don't have those situations where we we have an article on a pandemic, we need to actually discuss what goes into that article, what goes out. That could be done in an open way, but it doesn't mean that every single viewpoint gets equal footing and there's the tension between competing ideas in controversies just gets sort of given infinite space. So I think that there's additional research in how these pieces of the open model need to be brought along with other principles of openness and transparency.
So there's another question in the chat. Have any of the panelists engaged with policies to address platforms' ability to profit off of misinformation or disinformation and disincentivizing the revenue models? I'll quickly mention that does tie in to a different paper, does tie in quite directly to a different paper in the series that approaches this directly, but sort of from the other side. Eva Hartman's paper discusses ad libraries that are cross-checked against fact-checking databases, so that Tide or Ford or whoever it is, if their advertising is actually getting pushed on these fake news websites, commercial fake news websites, that there's an increasing ability to put commercial pressure on them, like there was before programmatic advertising. So that addresses that to a certain degree. But I also think that Lisa's paper Lisa's proposal has an interesting component of that, insofar as by taxing platforms based on their users, it provides a strong incentive for platforms to clean up bot accounts and fraudulent accounts. So that I thought was quite interesting. Lisa, do you want, I don't know if I just, Lisa, do you want to expand on that at all?
Well, first, you got it exactly right. Although we're familiar with some proposals that create trust funds for the benefit of journalism through a tax structure, we feel that there is more incentive power in one based on monthly active users for just the reason that Michael described, that it's an incentive on fraudulent or duplicative or corrupt accounts to do that. As a former marketer who helped fund and perfect some of the platform's business models, I've come to believe that they can do a lot of damage. As it relates to disinformation specifically, we've watched with interest the development of legislative proposals to try to regulate algorithms or remove immunity protection from things that are algorithmically amplified. But they're all significantly challenged through the difficulty of defining an algorithm. Reverse chronological is an algorithm, alphabetical is an algorithm. And so we haven't yet seen any that would kind of solve the problem without inducing other problems. It does mean, though, for us at Public Knowledge, that our Swiss cheese involves solutions that go well above those that are specifically focused on information quality. We're very strong advocates for antitrust enforcement and potentially new antitrust mechanisms that are specifically directed at the unique nature of the platform's business models. We've come out with a proposal advocating for a dedicated digital regulator that has both the expertise and the agility to regulate digital technology platforms in a way that kind of reins in some of the excesses of their business model. So we feel that some of those broader solutions may get at the negative outcomes of their business models versus solutions that are specifically focused on changing their algorithms or regulating their algorithms or removing immunity from things that are algorithmically amplified.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and just to add, I think we can learn a lot from Professor Jack Balkin's work on information fiduciaries, this concept. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that space. We don't tend to worry about our physician doing things with, that folder that they used to, put behind the administrator's desk with all of our personal information in it. I sort of wonder how we can get to a space where there's some sort of normative ethical framework that we can expect from the platforms that we engage with all the time, whether we see them or we don't see them. So that's one thing to comment on. Again, no easy answer there, certainly. One other thing that I think is important to emphasize is we also have to be careful about this notion of expecting that the information environments are really going to improve. As I often say in class, The answer is not to ban Wikipedia. The answer is to teach students to use Wikipedia effectively. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to write this policy paper on information literacy, is because as you know, the famous study in Nature determined, whether you're looking at the Britannica or Wikipedia, there is bias everywhere. There is missing information everywhere, right? So we need to teach individuals, again, to be careful about trusting individual sources and to expect that the environment is going to be easy to access, or easy to navigate rather, and safe. So that's one of the reasons that I think this, we're talking about 21st century skills. We're talking about a 21st century civil rights challenge, I think, as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. It really does tie into this broader idea of how we process, handle, and how we process information, and what do we do with information. I think there's a traditional, certainly growing up, there's a traditional way of I remember the traditional way of looking at things was you read it somewhere and it's true. It's in a book, it's true. It's in this authoritative source, it's true. And one of the most, I think, difficult avenues of navigating the current information environment is this idea that information should always be, it always needs to be viewed through a filter. Everything is biased in a particular way. Everything is inflected by particular ideas or preconceptions, and you can look at things as more authoritative or less authoritative than others. But ultimately, it's important to view information through that kind of a lens, and to process it in a particular way. There's a question in the chat about distinguishing, and that also I think ties into this question that's in the chat about distinguishing information literacy from traditional literacy, media literacy, news literacy. I think that also goes quite to the core of Jonathan's paper, and this idea. Certainly, I remember being active in digital rights work 10 years ago, where there was this really pervasive idea that just connect people to the internet and good things will happen. All you need to do is get people online, and good things are going to come from that. And it's funny how the game has changed a little bit. And one of the things that I really liked about both the proposal as it was originally drafted and the paper is this idea that there needs to be a careful and contextual approach about the impacts of internet access and the responsibility that comes with that. So I don't know if either Jonathan or Sandra or anyone else wants to comment on the question that's the comment in the queue.
Well, I already shared 2 links to reports that essentially discuss all those terms. The short answer is that even though they sound very different, these terms, they have a lot in common. And even among those who use one term, there is very little consensus in terms of what the term actually means or includes. But it's there, and we describe it on many pages, so everyone can read it in detail if of more interest. But it's more, I think it's more, these terms are more about the communities it brings to the table or into a room to discuss an issue, rather than what they actually then probably address.
I'll just add, one of the things I think it's important to emphasize, and I see in the chat, there's a comment about digital policy literacy. Again, it's just to reiterate about this concept, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're teaching people like the skills, and again, we need to organize, I think, more effectively, like what sort of a hierarchy of skills and knowledge, and of course to be careful about doing that as well. Understanding how the infrastructure works, understanding the policy processes, and being engaged in policy processes as well, and the political economy is important as well. And this is what digital policy literacy is all about. Shade and Shepard talk about like individual, years ago now already, like individuals being connected to these exploitative structures. And now people are talking about dark patterns, so-called, all the time, like influencing which way we go online, and how quick, putting us in fast lanes to monetize sections of services, for example, which can be highly problematic, of course. So I think, again, just to reiterate, I think, again, vision and leadership are important. In the library and information sciences, scholars have been writing for years about meta-literacy, critical information literacy, media literacy. There's so many different terms and strategies out there. We need to sort of organize them. I chose information literacy because I think it kind of fits as a term for what we're aiming to achieve. But again, I think just to sort of answer that part of the question, I think we need to really organize the skills, and that's why we need leadership.
So I was hoping to also ask to open this conversation up a little bit and talk about scalability and both the potential international application of these ideas, as well as the cross-cultural challenges that come with that. So, both of the proposals are in their specific elaboration are written targeted at a US context in terms of that specific policy framework and the constitutional considerations or what have you. But certainly both ideas absolutely lend themselves to scaling out. And one could easily imagine a context where multiple countries are establishing their own funds, or multiple countries are collaborating to establish a fund. And likewise, just about every country out there has some sort of information access initiative that's running, which of course leads itself to its own questions around how that should be balanced and how resources should be balanced, and whether the equation changes when you're dealing with countries that are less developed. Maybe could we get each of the authors, first Lisa and then Jonathan, to discuss potential international considerations, and then I would love to potentially hear from the commenters as well about their own thoughts about the international application of these theories, because both of you have your own expertise on these issues.
Well, you're absolutely right that at the core of the Superfund proposal is trying to scale and provide a more robust funding source for a method that's been associated with kind of mitigating misinformation. So that's definitely kind of what it's about. We've given some thought to how this would extend beyond the United States, particularly since I think, as we all know, the platforms struggle today effectively dealing with misinformation. It's a very US-centric, English-centric, set of policies and procedures that they have today. So being able to do a better job in other countries around the world would have great benefit. We've structured the Superfund proposal such that the funding source is global monthly active users, on the expectation that anything removed from the US would have benefit elsewhere because of the way that information travels, without boundaries. That said, yes, it could be broken down. It could be where the monthly active users in a particular geography were set and used to create a trust fund for fact-checking partnerships in that geography that had the local expertise, the language expertise, the cultural expertise, and sort of different voices to bring to that process. So clearly the administration of it would need to be adjusted to the regulatory environment in each geography. But the core idea of monthly active users being the basis of funding, establishing relationships that serve the interests of a distinct community and that have distinct cultural and language expertise, and it would all be additive in terms of how information flows. So we've done it conceptually. We'd have a lot of work to do on the different sort of geographic and national regulatory environments, but we think the core idea is one that could travel.
Well, and also I would add the role of the government, because that's certainly, I know that's very present in your proposal for constitutional reasons, at least in part. It is about balancing and being very delicate about the role of the government. And that's something that's going to vary place to place, where there are certain jurisdictions where governments are going to be more keen to take a strong role and should are less likely it's more dangerous for them to take a good role for exactly that reason often. These are all considerations. Jonathan, did you want to add this?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think if we borrow from the privacy space, again, while it's not the best model necessarily, the OECD's fair information practice principles, which have guided the direction of privacy law internationally, I think it could be a model where we see like organizations like the OECD reflecting more on this particular set of challenges. I think, and then could lead to, country or region specific policy and vision, again, with a focus on local, being central there as well. In the paper, I briefly reference the, available on the Wikimedia Commons, the IFLA, the International Federation for, Libraries, the how to spot fake news infographic, which was released very early and I'm sure has been used quite widely across the world as a way to start thinking about different strategies for addressing the fake news challenge, so-called. So yeah, I mean, I certainly think that vision and funding could be a focus of governments around the world. Yeah, should be, I think.
Could I ask Stephen, because I know that this is so core, cross-cultural challenges, cross-jurisdictional challenges are so core to some of the problems that Wikimedia has to navigate, not only in terms of ensuring access in different cultural contexts, in terms of different national contexts, where there might be not only different understandings of, say, a particular historical event, but legal structures on how a historical event can be described. And then you add to that the different linguistic challenges for the different versions of Wikimedia. Do you want to maybe comment on how that circle is squared or how that challenge manifests?
Yeah, I would just start off by saying that this question is unavoidable on the internet. Things move instantaneously around the world. Partially, some of our conversations about internationalizing these solutions is somewhat artificial among sort of people who think about jurisdiction. It is going to happen one way or the other, just due to the technological setup of the internet we have today. I think it does raise questions about the internet we will have tomorrow, because policy trends do show some increasing interest in creating barriers to international flow of information. I think in Wikimedia's space, having internationally common standards for doing fact checking and other things is a tremendous value, because it allows multiple perspectives that share a common language to really come in and have these kinds of conversations that produce high quality information. So I worry a lot about maybe policy trends that might be unrelated to disinformation, maybe related to privacy or other goals, creating more of these filter bubbles or sort of network balkanization that can have an impact on misinformation problems. I also will I think it's important for anyone who's proposing models in this space to track closely how other countries are using, many countries are using legislative approaches around disinformation or fake news to justify some really dangerous regulatory proposals. Anywhere you see the internet being shut down or access being cut off, that may be reported in the news as something to do with political unrest or trying to prevent social organizing or dissent. When you actually look at some of the justifications for those actions that are coming from the government, it is often around misinformation. So models that any country creates, I think, have an obligation to think about how this will be used in other places, potentially even by governments that don't share the same intentions as the policymakers we're speaking with. And finally, I think language is a huge barrier. If you read Wikipedia in multiple languages, you'll notice it covers the same topic in different ways depending on which language you're reading because of the information sources. I think part of that is natural and healthy, but to some of the points that Jonathan has raised, we need to be thinking about these sort of cross-language issues and thinking about information literacy in the context that we live in sort of an information or a language bubble, and that will also just influence what kind of things we can fact check and how well our skills can be put to use.
Yeah, that point about abusive legal frameworks is such an important one, and that I don't think I mentioned this at the outset, but that is really the impetus for this series. Has been that over the past year, particularly, there's been a growing trend in countries criminalizing misinformation, false news, fake news. That's been a trend that's been escalating since 2016, 2017, and has skyrocketed under COVID-19, with either new laws being passed or escalation in the enforcement of these fake news laws or misinformation laws, and they're being abused to target journalists, to target civil society, to target opposition figures, to internet shutdowns. So this is a growing and very concerning trend that really was at the core of why we wanted to put these potential alternative regulatory responses, is to provide space to explore alternatives that don't engage those kinds of sanctions and don't bring up the same kind of human rights concerns. So thank you so much for that. We're just at the half hour at the moment. So I will wrap it up here. I want to thank our authors and our panelists and everyone else for coming. I very much enjoyed this conversation. This is the second of 3 launch events, and the third will be on Friday, starting at noon Eastern. So I hope to see some or all of you there. Well, we will be discussing corporate governance reforms to platforms as a solution to this. Thank you all for attending. I enjoyed it very much.